President Trump thought he had his neighbors in a trap. By launching a punishing trade war, he expected to divide and conquer Canada and Mexico, forcing them into submission one by one. But while Washington prepared for two separate fights, something stunning was happening behind the scenes. In quiet meetings and coordinated diplomatic maneuvers, America's closest partners were forming a secret alliance. Even the US was stunned by what they did next. How did these two nations, caught in the crossfire, join forces to outsmart a superpower's gambit? For a generation, North America operated as one of the world's most formidable economic machines. The North American Free Trade Agreement, later renegotiated as the USMCA, wasn't just a deal. It was the blueprint for a continental partnership. It erased economic borders, creating deeply intertwined supply chains that powered all three nations. From the auto plants of Ontario and Querétaro to the agricultural fields of the Midwest, the continent moved as one, a model of shared prosperity built on the idea that they were stronger together. But this foundation of cooperation was systematically undermined by the America First doctrine, which viewed this partnership not as a source of mutual strength, but as a zero-sum game. The Trump administration operated on a classic divide and conquer strategy. The core belief was that the United States, due to its sheer economic size, could impose its will on Canada and Mexico individually. By pressuring them in separate negotiations, Washington could extract concessions from one and then use those wins as leverage against the other. The assumption was that the two nations were too different and too dependent on the US to ever form a truly united front. This fundamental miscalculation would prove to be the fatal flaw in Trump's entire North American strategy. The White House strategy was a textbook exercise in economic coercion. President Trump unleashed a barrage of punitive tariffs, threatening duties as high as 35% on Canada and 25% on Mexico. This wasn't a nuanced policy, it was a sledgehammer intended to create a sense of crisis and panic in both Ottawa and Mexico City. The entire gambit was built on the divide and conquer theory. The administration was convinced that it could force its two neighbors into a race to the bottom, each one scrambling to cut a deal with Washington to avoid being left behind. By negotiating with them separately, the US could exploit their individual vulnerabilities, Canada's reliance on commodity exports, Mexico's on manufacturing, and prevent them from forming any kind of collective defense. The White House expected two swift and separate surrenders. The public rationale was a mix of grievances about trade deficits and border security, but the strategic goal was singular: to shatter the existing continental partnership and rebuild it with the United States firmly and explicitly at the top. The administration believed that Canada and Mexico were little more than client states, economically beholden to the US and incapable of sophisticated, independent action. There was little to no consideration given to the possibility that they might coordinate a response. Why would they? Their economies were often in competition, and for decades, their most important relationship had always been vertical, with Washington, not horizontal with each other. This arrogant assumption, this failure to see the potential for a new alliance, was the critical miscalculation that would cause the entire tariff trap to backfire spectacularly. While Washington was preparing for two separate fights, something unprecedented was happening. Instead of panicking and turning on each other, Canada and Mexico did the one thing the Trump administration never anticipated. They started talking to each other. The first move was a brilliant piece of diplomacy by Mexico. In negotiations with the US, they managed to secure a 90-day delay on the tariff threat, buying invaluable time. That time was not wasted. High-level meetings, like a pivotal one in Mexico City, quickly followed. Canadian and Mexican cabinet ministers sat down not as rivals, but as allies in a shared crisis. They discussed building sustainable, integrated supply chains, strengthening port-to-port shipping, and collaborating on future-facing industries like AI and the digital economy. They weren't just planning a defense, they were designing a new, more resilient North American economy without the US at its center, During these meetings, they uncovered the fatal flaw in Trump's plan. The key to their defense was hidden in plain sight, buried in the fine print of the USMCA, the very trade deal Trump himself had championed. They realized that due to its specific rules, the vast majority of their trade was legally exempt from the kind of broad, unilateral tariffs Trump was trying to impose. For Canada, a stunning 95% of its goods, including nearly 100% of its vital energy exports, were protected. For Mexico, the figure was over 84%. Trump had built a prison, but his own agreement had left the doors wide open. Armed with this knowledge, they crafted a unified strategy. They would absorb the limited hit from the tariffs while using the USMCA as a legal shield, rendering Trump's primary weapon almost useless. They had turned the tariff trap into a paper tiger. The result was a political shockwave that left Washington stunned. The Trump administration had expected to be the ringmaster of a continental circus, pitting its two neighbors against each other. Instead, it found itself facing a unified, strategic, and legally shielded North American bloc. The divide and conquer strategy was dead on arrival. The two nations Washington had dismissed as weak and dependent had quietly and effectively outmaneuvered a superpower. The tariff trap, designed to project American strength, had instead exposed its limits. It had backfired, unintentionally forging a stronger, more independent alliance on America's own doorstep and leaving the White House isolated within its own continent. While the unified strategy was a brilliant geopolitical success, it did not provide total immunity from economic pain. Even if 95% of Canadian trade was protected, the remaining 5% was still worth billions of dollars, and those unprotected industries felt the full force of Trump's tariffs. For a Canadian steelworker in Sault Ste. Marie or a Mexican auto parts worker in Guanajuato, the legal nuances of the USMCA offered little comfort when their jobs were suddenly at risk. These are communities built around industry, where a stable job is the foundation of a family's future. The tariffs, however blunted, still created immense uncertainty, forcing companies to scale back investments and putting thousands of jobs in jeopardy. Standing up to the United States was a necessary act of sovereignty, but it was the workers on the factory floors who bore the immediate cost. The conflict also forced a difficult and expensive economic pivot. Both Canada and Mexico had to accelerate their efforts to diversify their trade relationships, seeking out new markets in Europe and Asia to reduce their long-term dependence on the volatile US market. This is a massive undertaking, requiring years of negotiations and billions in investment. While this strategic shift promised a more independent future, in the short term, it created disruption and anxiety. The shared strategy was a shield, not a magic wand, and the cost of defending their sovereignty was very real. The blowback on the United States was equally severe, a clear demonstration that you cannot wage war on your own supply chain without shooting yourself in the foot. American industries that had relied for decades on the seamless integration of the North American economy were thrown into chaos. US farmers, who trusted Canada and Mexico as their largest and most reliable customers, suddenly found themselves facing retaliatory tariffs that made their products too expensive. For a corn grower in the Midwest or a pork producer in North Carolina, the loss of these markets was a direct hit to their livelihood, a devastating consequence of a political strategy they had no say in. The pain was just as intense in the manufacturing heartland. American auto giants like Ford and GM depend on a constant, predictable flow of parts from their plants in Canada and Mexico. The tariffs and the resulting border friction disrupted this delicate dance, causing delays, raising costs, and making American-made cars more expensive to produce. A factory manager in Michigan trying to keep their assembly line running was now dealing with logistical nightmares created by their own government's policies. The attempt to punish America's partners had become a direct tax on American businesses and consumers, a clear and painful lesson in the perils of economic self-harm. A president's attempt to divide and conquer has backfired, unexpectedly forging a powerful new alliance between the two nations he sought to intimidate. The tariff trap designed to assert American dominance, has instead exposed the limits of unilateral power and reshaped the continent. The old foundation of a US-centric North America is broken, leaving three partners to navigate a new and uncertain future. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will all three nations lose by trying to go it alone? Are you American, Canadian, or Mexican? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.